Hello. The conversation that follows is an extract from the second panel of the NATO Industry Forum on May 21. General Thomas Sharpie, ACT, and General Suez, ACO, represent customer needs and expectation. The organizer decided to add to the panel the service provider. I leave up to you to evaluate their answer. If I have been the panel organizer, rather than putting a procurement agency within this panel, I would like to put the support group to the synod that has industrial experience and that can help improve understanding of the warfighter's demand and needs by the industry. I want to suggest that you pay attention to Sharpie and Zeus. They are the voice of the customer. And you all know that the best results from the industry are achieved when there is a maximum customer intimacy. I wish you a good and fruitful listening.
Well, today's panel will be discussing mission-driven capability development. The format will be a facilitated Q&A with a hand-selected set of experts and leaders. We will also have an open discussion period, so please do use the online chat feature to post your questions directly. We've had the opportunity over the past few months to collaborate on some of the challenges and opportunities facing NATO. Our panelists represent the voice of the customer, in this case, the warfighter, that end user. Service provider, for the integrated capabilities that NATO must provide, as well as industry. We each play a critical role in ensuring our warfighters are ready to go should the flag go up. This drives our imperative to deliver capabilities into the hands of the warfighters at pace. Most of you have heard the hype term DevOps, DevSecOps. In industry as well as government, I've observed many announcing that they will do DevOps. That's the answer. Quite frankly, DevSecOps is not a methodology, and it's not something that you buy or acquire. It is a set of principles and capabilities that include culture, people, process, and technology. So as government and industry have attempted to modernize by leveraging these principles, there needs to be a shift in focus. And in getting to know the panelists, we've shared similar experiences and we've come to the same conclusion. The goal is not to do DevOps or DevSecOps. The goal, deliver value, that is capabilities directly into the hands of the warfighter, driven by the mission. That's the focus for today, folks. Instead of me talking, let's have each of our esteemed panelists introduce themselves. I'd like to start with a warfighter representative and the voice of the customer. This will be Major General Boisauge. Zeus, would you introduce yourself, please?
Sure, Tracy, thank you. Good afternoon from Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers in Europe, commonly known as SHAPE here in Mons, Belgium. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Major General Piotr Zeus Boisauge. I am a Deputy Chief of Staff for Strategic Development and Preparation. As you heard, I represent today the user, the warfighter, who at the end has to employ the capabilities that I am provided with. At SHAPE, I'm responsible for all types of NATO strategic advance and crisis planning, programming of NATO collective training and exercises, force generation and readiness, as well as operational standards and inputs to the future capabilities. And I will stop at that, and I think now, Tom, to my force provider, over to you.
Let's pass that virtual mic. And I want to introduce General Tom Sharpie, Lieutenant General Tom Sharpie. He's the host of our event, and he's also a representative of the warfighter. Tom?
Hey, thanks, Tracy. Thanks, Zeus. Hey, I have a distinct pleasure to represent General Nada at Allied Command Transformation. So my duty title is Deputy Chief of Staff for Capability Development at Allied Command Transformation, coming to you from Norfolk, Virginia. This is a last panel did an awesome job. This panel shows the breadth of our experience with myself being in Norfolk, Zeus being in Mons, George being in Luxembourg, and Brian, I think, in DC. So that's our challenge of being globally distributed, working together. My job is to try and ensure that we meet the needs of the warfighter, as Zeus mentioned, to provide those capabilities that they need before they need them. And the focus of what I try and do is the nations provide the majority of those capabilities. I know Skip and his team will talk about some of that in the next session. But our job is to ensure that we provide interoperable, connective capabilities so that we can operate as an alliance as opposed to 30 individual nations. And so our goal today is to talk about some of the challenges, some of the opportunities, and how we leverage the strengths of that alliance of 30 nations, science and technologists, industry, academia, military departments, political engines, to ensure that we maintain that military edge. And our goal is to learn from industry how we can do it in a more agile manner and get away from the old methodology of a fixed requirement that's static for 10, 20 years to figure out how do we maintain that edge and use that approach, that methodology, to continuously update to ensure that we maintain that military edge. I'll stop there, and I look forward to the questions. I'll now turn it over to one of our experts that helps us to ensure that we acquire and helps us with those processes, Mr. George Buckingham from NSPA. George, over to you, my friend.
Hey, thanks, General. Good afternoon, all, and greetings from a surprisingly sunny Luxembourg. As you heard, George Buckingham. I'm the Chief of the Acquisition Planning and Development Office in the NATO Support and Procurement Agency, NSPA, and recognizing that not all of you will have heard of us. Our role is to deliver and support NATO and national capabilities and systems throughout the life cycle. So we do acquisition of systems, support them in service, and eventual disposal. And that's across all domains, but particularly the physical domains, so land, sea, air, and moving into space. We also support the warfighter directly, but for the purposes of this discussion, I think we're very much focused on that capability development and support. For today, what I'm really interested in, is a discussion about new views of doing what we do. Looking at innovation, accelerating delivery, which is a challenge, and encouraging cooperation between existing and new partners. So really looking forward to the discussion. And thanks for that. Back over to you, Tracy.
You bet. Thank you. Actually, our final panelist is Brian Finster. I've gotten to know Brian over the course of the last year, both in industry and now we're working together side by side in defense. Brian, can you talk a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Tracy. I'm Brian Finster. I just joined Platform One after spending 19 years in Walmart's supply chain and delivery platform organizations, most recently leading the DevOps dojo at Walmart. I'm a distinguished engineer and value stream architect for Platform One, trying to help bring a platform to help help everybody deliver things faster and more securely, and make it easier for people to build solutions.
Fantastic. For everyone, today I'll be using first names, or nicknames. Zeus, it makes it a lot easier. Thank you. So, folks, let's get to the questions. The first question I'd like to ask, I'm going to pose this to Tom and Zeus. So, Tom, first, the panel is focused on mission-driven capability development. So why don't we lay that definition flat? What do you mean when you're saying a mission-driven capability? What's under that umbrella?
So really, the needs of the warfighter need to be paramount in what we do. And in previous jobs that I've had doing acquisition and meeting the needs of the warfighter, we would buy a platform that we would have a fixed requirement that we determine, and then 20 years later we would deliver an airplane or a weapon system to meet that need. And then the warfighter would then say, does that exactly meet the needs of the warfighter? Sometimes yes, sometimes not exactly. And so the process that we have now, the new model that we've established, is those touch points with the warfighter are a part of every decision that we make from the beginning of the process through the entire life cycle of not only the acquisition, but then also the sustainment of that to ensure that the warfighter's needs are being met with those capabilities. It's just a change in the approach that we try and do, because at the end of the day, having a great capability matters only if it satisfies the warfighter needs. And as we looked at the NATO warfighting capstone concept, a lot of these technologies, a lot of these capabilities rely on smaller, faster, better. scrums to incrementally develop capabilities. And you're never going to get the perfect solution. We got to be more agile to be able to develop things and modify them to continue to make them, because the military instrument of power has to be updated. And the fact that we have Zeus as our partner, that every time we take a decision in governance, the warfighter gets to be in the room to say yes or no, it does or does not meet the requirement, that holds us to maintain that flexibility that's needed to adapt and adjust those capabilities to maintain that edge that's so prevalent. And so that's kind of what we're talking about, that mission-driven capability development with the warfighter driving what they need and overseeing whether we're doing it or not.
You as you talked about that, you mentioned the word value, and we'll double down on that in a few moments, because mission-driven capabilities are measured, to your point. Are they bringing the warfighters what they need? How do we define what they need? Well, it's working with the warfighters, it's working with Zeus to say what is the value, the actual measurable value. Gets us into an interesting conundrum, though. I'd like to ask Zeus and Tom both to weigh in on this. If we're focusing on mission-driven capabilities, is there a trade-off that has to happen between the voice of the customer and providing the capabilities? Like short-term, long-term, what do you run into?
Yeah, sure. I'll jump on that first before Zeus can pile on. The challenge is resourcing. If we were in a resource-free environment, as the last panel said, the budgets have grown, but they're not infinite. And so, we have to get the best value, as you say, the most capability for the warfighter within the resources that we're given. And so sometimes, we have to make trade-offs. If you want to have this capability that does everything, it might take 5, 10, 20 years to be able to develop and deliver that. But if I can incrementally give you some of that, the good enough perspective, and then incrementally develop it and continue to build upon it, it might not be as expensive, it might not be as complex. I might be able to deliver it faster to meet the majority of what is needed to satisfy that need, and then continue to develop it, mature it, because as you know, developing something that's perfect in the world of technological innovation and sprint and spiraling development, it's hard to do. And so those big programs with 20-year horizons, we need to break them down into smaller increments, deliver some of what the warfighter needs, and then continue to grow it so that it meets all of those things eventually, because what you start with and what you end with probably isn't the same thing, and that's where that resourcing problem is a challenge, especially with the NATO, because it's not just a CEO who has to decide, or one nation. We have to get a consensus and have to get 30 nations to agree on the resources to afford the warfighter the tools that they need. Zeus, over to you, my friend.
Thanks, Tom. If I may refer a little back to the previous question very quickly. From our perspective, what we want to achieve is obviously achieve the strategic effects that we want to achieve against any potential competitor. We also want to be able to pose dilemmas to this competitor and maintain this technological edge. And take into account the very dynamic security environment, the quick developments in the technology, and also new tactics, or even I would say strategy, coming from our peacetime competitors, because as we all know, they're trying to stay below this threshold of Article 5. This is where we really need the interested partnership and work together to be able to achieve, to deliver the strategic effect. Now, the trade-offs. As Tom, let me pile up on what Tom has said. There have to be trade-offs. They are always there in any system. The important thing is, from my perspective, that I get this mission-driven capability, at least elements, as soon as possible. I cannot wait for 20 years, because then I need to use legacy systems. I need to find some bridging solutions, and it's usually more expensive. Plus, when you think too big, the program gets too complicated, and there are always delays, and we all know it from our national and NATO experience. So whatever we do with the capabilities we think of, they have to be open architecture in nature. They need to be system of systems, so everybody, whatever nation has, should be able to plug in. And from my perspective is, first of all, cover the gaps that we see for this peacetime competition, potentially crisis and conflict now, but also define together with my brothers from ACT and with industry in partnership, there are new requirements for this competition in the future. Over.
So you brought up a couple of really good points. One of them, and this echoes what Tom said, you cannot wait. You cannot let perfect get in the way of good. Good enough, right? Get the job done very quickly. The second piece that you alluded to is something that I think all of the panelists have chatted about in our earlier conversations, and that is the power of a decoupled architecture. Being able to have technology insertion, rapid technology insertion and adoption. And that really is something that Brian, you've been focusing on with Platform One. Do you want to talk just a little bit about that aspect of Platform One? And then I have a couple of questions about mission, getting back to mission trade-offs.
Yeah, I think overall it's really important that we're not architecting for perfect, we're architecting for change and architecting for delivery. That things are going to continue to change as we go forward. We know this. And so architecting for when am I done is wrong. We're done when we delete it. And so we have to be focusing on this must be easy to change so we can rapidly evolve it. We have to be architecting for a sustainable delivery of that change, always.
Thank you. I think it was Neil Ford who originally coined the term evolutionary architectures. It's a fantastic read, and he's very strong in that sense of gone are the days where we ran really quickly to get the system built before we had to have the technology refresh. That was a multi-year technology refresh, so we can't continue to do that. Zeus, I have a question for you on the trade-offs. Are there times where you have to limit a sense of, maybe it's false urgency, that somebody wants something immediately and you have to deal with that? Can you talk a little bit about that impact?
Sure. Well, first of all, again, just expand a little bit on what I was saying, and that I think refers to the urgency. What we're facing now, again, is a multi-domain, multi-actor, multi-region, low to high-tech competition, peacetime competition we call it now, because the other side, the potential competitors or opponents or enemies, doesn't matter how we really call them, are always trying to use this technology. Then on the top of it, the urgency is obviously, hey, can I get it off the shelf, more or less? Is it ready to be somehow? Or that it will take a long time to develop, and then we have to make those judgments. So urgency, I would say, is sometimes difficult to define. Obviously, from our point of view, it's always about providing safety and security to our troops. And if that's at stake, then it's always urgent for us, no matter how much it costs or which shortcuts we need to take. Over.
Bringing George into the conversation. George, you are in an interesting position when you listen to all of this, that you are dealing with the acquisition side of this, you're dealing with all of the procurement. When you hear somebody say, like Brian say, software is never done, how does that change how you're approaching procurement?
Yeah, thanks, Tracy. I mean, it's interesting, and I agree for sure with the other panel members. I mean, we've got to focus on what the user's requirements are up front. So understanding what they are is really important. Bearing in mind getting a common view on requirements when you're talking about more than one nation, or even within one nation, is a challenge. And even within a small group, there's different perspectives. So the people who are funding have often got a very different perspective from the user who wants something quickly, and he wants as much scope as possible quickly. The funders have a different view, so that's a challenge. And what we see is, we can build reasonably cohesive teams who can manage contracts throughout life, but actually having a consistent user view is very difficult, because the military normally 2-3 years they're moving on. That's where I come from. We all understand that. So as I say, having a consistent view over time and across your user audience is a real challenge. And leave aside things we'll probably talk about later on, culture, aligning funding streams, acquisition and contracting. Those are all different challenges, but at the very high level, just building let's say, for the delivery, I don't think that's doable. Consistency from a user perspective and maintainable by this hardware, I think.
A colleague of mine uses the term minimum viable user for exactly the reason that you're talking about. If I have somebody who's quickly cycling through and they've just learned the software, they're going to be using the software for 6 months and then they're transitioning off, is that the voice, or is Zeus the voice, or is Brian the voice? Is there someone else who has to interpret it? So it's quite a conundrum, quite a conundrum. I'm wondering about it as you talked about this a little bit more. What are some of the challenges that you're seeing? We're working in non-traditional sorts of delivery, but what about the partners, working with the partners and non-traditional partners? Are there challenges and successes that you could talk to?
Yeah, that's a great question as well, thanks. I mean, I'll be clear, 95% of what we do as a NATO agency is delivered by industry. So, that partnership with industry is the heart of what we do, absolutely essential. And we are making efforts to engage with small and medium enterprises who often got that innovative outlook. But there are challenges in that. But for sure, we recognise, if you're going to tap in to the talent that's out there, you need to be talking to some of the non-traditional people, the partners and the contractors who we're not dealing with every day, because that's where this expertise, this out-of-the-box thinking, this innovation, this drive to innovate and change exists. So, for sure, we want it, but there are challenges. I mentioned earlier the cultural thing, and we spoke, we were talking earlier about the different risk approach between sort of the smaller enterprises and the innovation-driven, technology-driven enterprises who are looking at these incremental approaches, and they need continual injection of funds. That's not necessarily the way defence and NATO fund projects. So there's a challenge we have there. So that ties in with the processes. We, as a NATO agency representing NATO, spending taxpayers' money, tend to be quite conservative and process-driven in our processes. There's a lot of cooperation needed, and making sure that all stakeholders are involved and their equities are preserved. Quite rule-bound, and those are, I can see already from your face, don't necessarily read across to the innovative, agile culture that we really want to tap into. So it's squaring those two challenges. It's a pretty hard thing to do. One of the things I'd say is, we probably don't know everyone who's out there, and they probably don't know about us. Sometimes I suspect, defence maybe isn't as massive a market as it was in the olden days, the previous days, and firms will focus more on the quicker bang for the buck and focusing on the commercial applications of what they're doing. And there's challenges for us, if you're talking about the more innovative things, where there's a bit of research and development required, how do you fund that? How do you make sure that the firm has got the muscle to do that for the long run, bearing in mind that perhaps our contracting processes aren't paying and funding quite as quickly as they'd like. Going right back to the requirements, I think maybe one of our challenges, we do tend to probably over-specifying what we want. It's how high, how fast, what the range is, and perhaps we should be better focused on describing our problem in terminology that people can address the problem, rather than trying to meet our particular specifications. Back over to you, Tracy.
Actually, I saw Tom's head nodding a little bit earlier. Tom?
Yeah, thanks, Tracy. Thanks, George. I think that in the big picture, the what and the why is something we need to talk about. NATO's most successful alliance in the naval history of the world, last 71 years. And it was able to be successful because of the strength of the alliance. The what and the why is really what Zeus frames out as his needs and as the warfighter. And then, as you heard in the first panel, the NATO warfighting capstone concept built upon NDPP and DDA processes within NATO, where we define what capabilities nations are going to bring to the table, and then from a DDA perspective, what SACEUR needs to be able to maintain the military edge. That's the what and the why. what we're trying to figure out is the how. How do we take the status quo environment of the previous 7 years, now in this competitive environment that we're in, how do we deliver those things to meet the what and the why at the pace that's required in this competitive environment? And NATO has done a good job of trying to change their processes to morph that, but we're trying to figure out, General Anata would say, I want to push the test to change faster, to try and figure out how I use the agility, the mentality and methodology that our industry partners are doing, and how do we bring that into the NATO so that I can meet those what and the why at the pace that is required in some of these technological capabilities that we don't have decades to produce. And so that's what we need, and that relationship that George talked about is reaching out to industries that can help us to think differently and getting to that how in a NATO structure that allows us to change processes to be more adaptive, to be more agile. That's where we need help from industry. And we need help to not only learn that, but then to convince at 30 that that is something that we can achieve together and help make this alliance even stronger. So that, that's the part that really with that help from industry and how they do things, and then to be able to, codify that and then educate our partners in NATO headquarters so that we could do this together. That's the bridge between NATO warfare and capstone concept. And I know what Skip and his team will talk about in the next session. So
you see that as a way for the defense industrial base to really help the organization. You want to learn the techniques, or are there other things? Go ahead, Tom.
Sorry. Beyond that defense industrial base, those non-traditional industries out there that might be faster and more agile in some of the ways they think and the way they develop. We got to be able to maintain that edge from not only just the end part of that, but in the doctrine, the training, the human capital, and all those other capabilities. As Koss mentioned in the beginning, how do we go from a platform-centric to a network-centric, mosaic of warfare to be able to execute, with all the things that Brian talked about in that architecture, system of systems, pulling in the strengths of all those 30 into an interoperable capability that not only deters, but when deterrence fails, allows us to defend and win at any cost.
Fine. Let's build on that. So, total foot stomp that decoupled architectures, the importance of the architectures, but not everything is going to be custom built. I actually want to ask both Tom and George, are there barriers, whether they're real or perceived, for using some of the commercial technologies when you're thinking about innovation for NATO?
So I'll jump in real quick. I think that the biggest challenge is security. From a NATO perspective, you have 30 different nations that all have, their sovereignty is part of this process. And we can't, we have to ensure that anything that we put into the NATO network first is secure, and maintaining an architecture to do that. Easy to say, hard to do, right? Plus that system of systems, that's a great concept, but how do you actually do that when you have 30 different nations coming from different places to be able to do that? And then to get the policies that enable that trust that nations have to have in the security policies to ensure that we're secure. That I could go on and on. That's just one way of the challenges that we have to be able to get after.
George, I'd like to hear from you as well.
I mean, exactly, took the words out of my mouth, certainly on security. And I think going back to my earlier comments, one of the barriers is knowing about them, knowing about each other. And that's the beauty of events like this and other ones that General Sharkey's organisation are setting up with industry. That it breaks down those barriers so we begin to understand each other. And one of the things I also said to everyone is, the early requirements definition. We need to bring it up, talk about the problem, not talk about the specification. And the challenge is integration. I mean, security is a bit of this, but what we need is architectures and standards that allow modularity, that allows incremental development to be plugged in, rather than having to start from scratch every time. And it allows, very importantly for us, it allows for competition between different providers. So, coming towards some sort of common architectures and standards is, I think, very, very important. Other, practical issues. The military tends to be very concerned about things being soldier-proof. So we've got, very high climatic requirements, drop heights and all the rest of it. Those are things we will always get concerned about. the contractual issues I spoke about earlier, and those are, I mean, I wouldn't overlook them. You know, the difference between national funding processes and funding profiles, and when these agile suppliers need funding to keep innovating is a real challenge. Some countries are better than others, but that's not easy. Supply chain issues tied to the security. You know, we've seen that COVID brought them to stark addiction. But, you know, we're all clear how reliant we are on you know, a variety of suppliers across the world. So for some of the innovative stuff, LEDTs, you know, then there's a risk. You know, you don't even know where your suppliers are coming from, so there's security issues there. And then, you know, intellectual property, you know, issues like that, which we don't even really have time to go into because that will really drag us down a rabbit hole. I'll pass it back to you, Tracy.
A couple of really interesting things that I noted down while you were talking, George. You said the word requirements, and sometimes in agile philosophy, and I'll say early agile philosophy, elementary as folks getting used to it, there's maybe a common perception that requirements don't exist anymore. You just have user stories and you move very quickly. Requirements still exist, and that's a really important part of digital engineering as we're getting into digital twins, model-based systems engineering. We can have user stories, we can have epics, we can have all of those agile constructs. At the end of the day, they are requirements. It's how much of the requirement is defined up front versus what can we push out because it doesn't need to be defined up front. Second challenge that you called out is the integration. And one thing that I've noticed in talking with this organization as well as Air Force and Navy, U.S. Air Force and Navy, has been the mix of greenfield, unconstrained new development, and brownfield. And so we're working against potentially decades of different types of systems, getting into what we jokingly say is that olive, that shade of olive. So you're having the technologies available that allow us to connect the greenfield to the brownfield. I actually want to ask a question that goes down a different avenue for a moment. You know, as we're talking about maybe starting small or getting successes, Zeus, I'd actually like to poke at you a little bit and maybe have Brian weigh in from an industry perspective. Is there a time where you've done exactly that? You've hit it fast, you've started small, and it went well, and perhaps it became a success? Were there transitions or issues that you ran into that made it difficult to scale or to manage after that initial success? Zeus?
Tracy, thank you. If I can make also very quick comments to some of the previous ones. First of all, I think we in NATO have already learned that we cannot do more with less. That's why we have this defense investment pledge agreed by nations that we need to invest more in our capabilities, but especially this Section 2030 agenda also points that among those, the innovation and interoperability are key. And I think that throughout this discussion, we heard it a few times. The other point I want to make that yes, we need to reach out not only to the big corporations as we used to, but we also need to reach out to other entities, for example, the startups. And all of those that are out there, let's call it in general just the industry, we need you because you can help or influence to change our mindset, but also through educating us what is out there, what you can bring to the table, and how you can basically change how we do our military business. To the point that you ask about this things, well, first of all, I think it's difficult to have a clear definition about success, about small going well, small going too big, but I'll be careful, but I will touch on a few programs that in NATO you can either call a success or not such a success. Well, first, Alliance Ground Surveillance, it had some problems, it had some challenges, but at the end, this capability is there, and I think it will be developed, and we'll be adding more birds and more ability to have a great indications and warnings. The program that did not go so well for a number of reasons, I want to stress that, is obviously Air Command and Control System. And that one, and both of those programs have taught us great lessons, provided us great lessons identified, and we have lessons learned that now we're trying to apply to another great program that is ongoing, which is the Alliance Future Surveillance concept. Basically, the new capability to replace the AWACS. So I think I'll post this. Over to you, Tracy. Thank you.
Wonderful. Yep, wonderful stories, and I don't mean that as though they're fairy tales. Wonderful to hear those vignettes, those success vignettes. Brian, I want to ask you a quick question, then we're very shortly going to transition into some Q&A from the audience. Is there a point where you've started something and it's went well and it grew, whether it was a successful growth after that first burst or it became tenuous and crunchy? Can you provide an example from your industry experience?
Well, I'll say there's a couple of examples I can give. One is of observation. I've frequently seen rapid prototypes that people have built around good ideas get thrown into production and crash and burn because it just buries them in technical debt. You've got this idea and you presented it to leadership and they thought it was great. And instead of being able to harvest the idea and build a sustainable solution, and just drop that idea straight into production. Mm-hmm. And those always fail or take years to recover. And then personally, we started the dojo at Walmart small to help teams. It was an idea. Can we make this work? And then quickly got flooded with requests that made my lead time like 18 months in some cases to go and help teams. And so we had to go and try to pivot and figure out how to change that idea in a way that was sustainable growth without killing ourselves, because we were about to success ourselves out of business through customer dissatisfaction internally. And I think that's something we all have to be aware of, is we have to keep a mindset. What happens if this does succeed? Can we double down on it? Right? With the assumption that it may not.
You brought up a good point, and we're going to start to transition into our Q&A. The good point you brought up is the importance of understanding how to operationalize that prototype or that pilot or that experiment, because oftentimes we'll say, that was great, let's just move that over. And so there are philosophies and things that we need to put into play. Let's go ahead and I'm going to scroll through. We have a couple of questions that are coming in. I'd like to pivot these over and talk to you all about this. And forgive me, I'm going to be reading these from the prompter. Many future and current capabilities involve integration and using emerging and disruptive technologies. The policy and legislative frameworks that require us to use such technologies, like AI, vary among the NATO nations. Moreover, they can be much more restrictive in some non-NATO countries. Does this affect your mission planning? And if so, how? Some stakeholders suggest that international treaties on some of these items, like AI, are needed. What is your opinion?
Sure, I'll go. So Tracy, from my perspective, there's two ways to go about solving the problem. You can worry about what you can't do and why you can't do it, or you can agree on what you can use and how it benefits the alliance and what is good about some of those emerging and disruptive technologies. So my approach has always been, we should focus on the good that we can use, that we can agree upon at 30 to be able to use and develop, and start there. And then as you start maturing that and using it, some of the things that you might not have agreed with at the beginning, you may eventually get to a point where those come off the table because you realize that those things that you thought were bad actually are not. So let's focus on what we can use, what we agree upon, start developing and delivering before we just say, no, we can't because it's too hard.
Copy that. Zeus and George, is there anything that you'd add to that from a treaty perspective, especially when we're talking about AI, that has quite a lot of press right now and quite a lot of concern about the ethics around it? Is there a time where you feel that there should be an international treaty, whether it's with NATO members or not, that would impact softwares?
Well, let me take a stake in this one. Well, first of all, artificial intelligence is a great new future development that's happening as we speak. The challenge with NATO is obviously that NATO is not usually a part of any treaties per se. Usually, those are the member countries. So, and again, I'm not a lawyer, but that's what happens quite often for a number of things. But I guess it also applies a little bit to as an example, if I can use the F-35 issue, which, there are so many issues, so much worry about disclosing certain technologies, certain abilities of the aircraft that NATO per se doesn't have such a treaty and will not have, because not all members will have such a capability. But I think that's a little bit of an example that probably not all members will also have artificial intelligence and use it to the extent as the others. So NATO will probably not have such an agreement as a NATO, but I believe either MOU, meaning a number of allies will have something, or maybe there will be a different solution. Over.
Zeus, you had no way of knowing that I spend a good amount of my day working with F-35 right now, so you would have no way of knowing that tie-in. I'd actually like to, there's another question here. I'm not sure if this would be most appropriate for George, but I'll pitch this out. How do the results stemming from work like NWCC, like new missions, link to the work at ACT and its new role as NATO Capability Manager and Coordinator? Is that best answered by George, Zeus, or I see ACT written there, Tom?
I'd be delighted to hand it to General Sharpie.
Yeah, so Tracy, one of the things that we do, and Zeus and I talk about this all the time, right? Traditionally, we focus, in NATO on capability delivery, and so we're delivering capabilities based on obsolescence, based on programs that either are going to sunset or they need to be replaced. The difference with the DDA and the NWCC is now we're looking, as opposed to just delivering on obsolescence, delivering based on the needs of the warfighter for the future fight, so that we can deliver them the capabilities that they need them before they need them, right? So instead of just replacing, we're now looking to enhance and to upgrade and to make those from what takes in the future. And some of these weapon systems could be complex. It could take a long period amount of time, and so we're trying to do that. And we've adapted with our innovation unit and our innovation hub here, with partner with Old Dominion, is doing DevSecOps approach and doing MVPs, min viable products, to solve parts of the problems. And our challenge is, how do we take that and cross that wall to go from a demo, a prototype, an experiment, and exercise into the mass production, so that we can then deliver at scale to the nations. And so we're working on that, and it's how we're going to do that going forward into the future to develop capabilities, as opposed to just replacing obsolescence, is really what that futuristic look, what we're trying to do, and give Zeus what they need ahead of thinking about the gaps that they have before they need it. Because if we wait until they need it and try and develop it, we're going to be too late.
And I'll have a quick comment, Tracy, if I can. The way, I guess, easy to explain for the wider audience is that the concept for the deterrence and defense of the Euro-Atlantic area, the DDA, that you keep hearing the acronym, this is what we are focusing on, because we are the warfighter. This is against the threats that we have identified right now and in the near future. While NWCC the idea is that we'll carry it forward into the mid to long term to ensure that we are prepared to conduct our missions and achieve the desired effect in this future operating environment. Over.
Thank you. What we need to do, though, in the essence of time, this has been a fantastic panel, and I want to thank each one of you. It has been enjoyable for me to expand my network, to get to know all of you over the last couple of months. General Sharpie, as our host, I want to turn it over to you for closeout.
Hey, thanks, Tracy. Before I get to the end, I'd like to go around each of the panel members, because I'm a task-oriented person. I'd like to give them 30 seconds to summarize what opportunities they see and how do we leverage this relationship with industry and our partners going forward. And so what takeaway they do, so we can build upon this as we look at future sessions in this program. This, as you said, was the first. but I think we can do many more, and I think it'll help us as we dialogue between us and our industry partners, and coupled with the other panels and how we go forward from here. So I'd like to turn it over to start with Zeus first. 30 seconds.
Well, it will be difficult, but let me try. First, so to sum up, I think from a warfighter perspective, we should be in the process since the beginning, from the very end, and even when we get the capability through the cycle, we still need to be involved to make it even better. That's why this partnership with the industry, with the startups and so on, is so crucial. You are the one that can drive the change in our mindset and also in educate us how we can do our military business practices. Over.
Add your sentence to my wall of quotes. We need to be obsessed with the end user. Tom, is there anything that you'd add as your imperative, your 30 seconds?
Sorry, first of all, Operator Erics. Hey, thanks, Tracy, for moderating. Thanks, Brian, for your insightful wisdom. George, thanks, as always, for your partnership. And Zeus, thanks for making sure that we get it right. I think, this is the beginning of this journey. Zeus and I have been doing it for a while, and it's about effects, right? Because it's not about profit centers. It's not about being first to market. It's about maintaining that military edge that enables that deterrent effect so that any potential adversary out there has pause before they try and rise to a level of a declaration. And we need to make sure that we collectively use all the instruments of power that are out there in our nations, in our industry, and in our militaries to ensure that we do that. And it's really about the coherence that we have to have. And this is the beginning of that journey, because if we don't do it together, we're going to lose. And being second in the military fight isn't good enough. And the fact that DODs are not leading the technological revolution or delivery means industry must be central, a part of every single process that we do in order to make sure that we get the how right, but more importantly, to make sure that the what and why are met so that we have that deterrent effect and that nobody thinks twice about rising to a declaration. That's our challenge, that's our goal, and we need all of us to help us, not just some of us. Thank you for your time. I look forward to continuous discussion another day.
Thanks all.